The stagecoach had been rolling for 3 days, and Wren Calloway had not slept for most of them. It was not the jolting of the wheels against the frozen road, though that was considerable. It was not the cold seeping through the cracked leather curtain beside her seat, though that was considerable too. It was the letter. The one folded into a precise rectangle and tucked inside the left breast pocket of her traveling coat, pressed flat against her ribs, like a second heartbeat she hadn't asked for. She had read it so many times the creases were beginning to soften. She knew every word without looking. But somewhere around the second night, somewhere between the last town with a name she recognized and the first stretch of open land that seemed to go on past the edge of the world, Wren had taken the letter out again. Not to read it, just to hold it. Her copy of the contract was 2 pages. Most of it was practical language about shared labor, shared property during the term, and the expectations of both parties with respect to the running of a working ranch. She had read those sections carefully. She was good at careful reading. It was one of the things her late husband's family had never appreciated about her, that she read everything, remembered everything, noticed the small print other people waved past. It was the final clause she kept returning to. This union may be dissolved by mutual agreement of both parties no earlier than 12 months from the date of signing, provided neither party has acted in violation of the terms herein. 12 months. Not a lifetime. Not a promise. A contract with an exit written into it from the beginning, as if the man who had drafted it already assumed it would be needed. Wren folded the letter back into its rectangle, tucked it against her ribs again, and looked out the window. The land outside was enormous in a way that felt almost aggressive. Back east, the landscape had the decency to be interrupted by buildings, by tree lines, by the reassuring geometry of fences and church steeples, and the smoke from other people's chimneys. Here there was none of that. There was only the valley, broad and pale gold beneath the autumn sky, rimmed on 3 sides by ridgelines that looked like they had been pushed up from the earth by something impatient. The grass moved in long, slow waves. The clouds above threw shadows that traveled across the hills like living things. It was the most beautiful place Wren had ever seen. She did not find this comforting. Beautiful things in her experience had a way of belonging to someone else. The stagecoach lurched to a stop with a grinding protest from the wheels and a sharp call from the driver that Wren didn't quite catch. She pressed her face toward the gap in the curtain. A wooden platform. A water trough. 3 buildings in a rough row, their facades so weathered the paint had given up entirely. A hand-lettered sign above the largest building read simply, Ironwood Station. She was here. Wren gathered her traveling bag, one bag, all she had brought, all she had left after the settlement, and pushed open the stagecoach door herself without waiting for assistance. The cold hit her immediately clean and sharp in the back of her throat, carrying the scent of pine and distance. She stepped down onto the wooden platform and straightened her coat and looked around. There was a man standing at the far edge of the platform, slightly apart from the small cluster of people who had come to meet the stage. He was watching her, not the way men sometimes watched women arriving alone with appetite or assessment, or the particular species of pity that felt worse than contempt. He was watching her the way a person watches something they are trying to understand before committing to a reaction. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent years doing work that required it rather than seeking it. His coat was heavy canvas worn at the elbows, and his hat was pulled low against the wind. The face beneath it was angular a jaw that looked like it had been set once and never released eyes that were a shade of gray-green that reminded Wren oddly of the river back home in October just before the cold fully arrived. There was a scar along his left forearm where the coat sleeve had ridden up. An old one. He didn't seem to notice it. He did not smile when she looked at him. He also did not look away. Wren walked toward him with her bag in her right hand and her chin at a height she had practiced not too high to seem brittle, not too low to seem broken. She stopped at a distance that was neither close nor rude. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to fill space to occupy it. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to have a shape. "The drive takes about 40 minutes from here," Colt Hawthorne said. "The road is rough in spots. I brought the covered wagon." "That's fine," Wren said. He picked up her bag before she could protest, not with a flourish, simply with the efficiency of a man accustomed to lifting things, and walked toward the wagon without looking back to see if she followed. She followed. The drive to the Hawthorne Ranch was conducted mostly in silence. Colt handled the horses with the ease of long familiarity, his hands loose on the reins, his eyes on the road ahead. Wren sat beside him on the bench and looked at the land moving past and did not attempt to fill the quiet with the kind of small talk she had once been good at and had since lost the taste for. At one point, the road curved around the base of a long, rocky ridge, and suddenly the valley opened up below them wide and amber in the late afternoon light, a dark thread of water visible in the middle distance, and at the far end of the valley, a cluster of buildings that she understood even from here to be a working place rather than a merely inhabited one. Barns and outbuildings and corral fencing and the solid low shape of a house that looked like it had been built to last rather than to impress. "That's ironwood," Colt said. It was the first thing either of them had said in 20 minutes. Wren looked at it for a long moment. "It's substantial," she said. Something shifted briefly in his expression too fast to name. "It was my father's before mine," he said, "and his father's before that." She understood from the way he said it that this was not a casual piece of family history. This was the only context she needed to understand everything. The ranch was exactly what it had appeared to be from the ridge, a working place, functional and undecorated, with the particular character of a property that had been maintained with care but not softened with comfort. The yard was clean. The fences were sound. The barn doors hung straight on their hinges. But there were no curtains on the house windows, and no flowers along the porch steps, and no evidence of the 100 small gestures that turned a structure into a home. Colt showed her the house with the directness of a man giving a tour of an operation, not a residence. The kitchen, the water pump, the wood stove, and the cord of firewood stacked beside it. The main room with its plain table and 2 chairs and the iron hook above the fireplace. And then the room at the end of the short hallway, a small room simply furnished with a narrow window that looked out onto the eastern pasture, a bed made up with a heavy quilt, a small table, and a chair. On the inside of the door, there was a lock. A good one recently installed, the brass of it still bright against the old wood. Wren looked at the lock for a moment without speaking. "The key is on the table," Colt said from behind her in the doorway. "I had it put in last week. The room is yours for the duration." He paused. "I don't come in here." Wren turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that same careful attention from the platform, waiting for her reaction before committing to his own. I don't expect anything from this arrangement beyond what is written in the contract, he said. I need a legal wife before spring. You need a place. That's what this is. It was, Wren thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. Perhaps that was why it landed with such particular weight in the center of her chest. I understand, she said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when an agreement has been confirmed, and left her to settle in. Wren stood alone in the small room for a long moment after his footsteps retreated down the hallway. She set her bag on the chair. She walked to the window and looked out at the eastern pasture, dry grass moving in the wind, the last of the day's light going copper at the edges of the hills. Then she took her copy of the contract from inside her coat, smoothed it on the small table, and read the final clause one more time. 12 months. She sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt was heavy and smelled faintly of cedar. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with a sound like the land breathing. Wren Calloway pressed her palms flat against her thighs and told herself firmly and without drama that she would be fine. She almost believed it. The next morning, she met Opal Briggs. The woman appeared at the kitchen door just after sunrise, carrying a covered basket and trailing the scent of wood smoke and something sweet baking. She was somewhere in her 60s with a broad face that had long made its peace with weather white hair pinned up with the energy of someone who put it up every morning for the pure habit of it, and eyes the color of strong coffee that missed very little. You'll be the new Mrs. Hawthorne, Opal said, setting the basket on the kitchen table without being invited. I'm Opal Briggs. My place is over the East Ridge, 20 minutes by Horse 40 if you walk it in mud. I've been a neighbor to this family for 30 years, and I have opinions which I share freely, so you might as well know that about me early on. Wren, who had been standing at the wood stove with a cup of coffee, and the wary stillness of someone still assessing every new situation for hidden costs, looked at this woman and felt something unexpected move through her, something almost like recognition. Wren Calloway, she said, sit down if you'd like. Opal opened the basket and produced a loaf of something dense and golden brown that filled the kitchen with the smell of brown butter and dried fruit. She cut 2 slices without asking, and pushed one toward Wren with the casual authority of a woman who had been feeding people through their hard times for decades. I want you to know what you've come into, Opal said, not unkindly, directly. Wren sat down. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Tell me. So Opal told her. About Reginald Hawthorne Colt's father, who had died some years back, leaving a will with an unusual provision that the property would pass to his son, only if that son was married by his 40th birthday the following spring. About Jerome Hawthorne, the younger brother who had been waiting with the particular patience of a man who had learned to be patient because the alternative was losing. And about a deal Jerome had made with a land development company, a deal made quietly. A deal that would, if Jerome took possession of the Hawthorne Ranch, allow that company to acquire enough of the valley's land and water rights to change the shape of Ironwood forever. Not just this ranch, Opal said, tearing her bread with steady hands. Every farm and homestead in this valley. The Prentice family, the McGrew widow, the Lund brothers, who've been here 40 years. Jerome's deal doesn't stop at the Hawthorne fence line. Wren was quiet for a moment. Does Colt know about Jerome's arrangement with the company? He knows Jerome wants the land. He doesn't know the full picture. Opal looked at her steadily. I thought the new wife deserved to. Wren set down her cup. She looked at the bread Opal had brought, dense and golden and given without condition, and felt the quiet machinery of understanding clicking into place. She had come here thinking she was a piece on someone else's board. She was beginning to realize the board was larger than anyone had told her. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Opal nodded as if this was settled. "How do you take your coffee, then?" That night Wren could not sleep. It was not entirely unexpected. She had not slept properly in months, since before the funeral, if she was honest, since before the long, slow end of the life she had expected to be living. The bed in her small room at Ironwood was the most comfortable she had slept in since the house had been taken, and still sleep refused her with the reliably perverse logic of exhaustion. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into the night. The wind, the creak of the timbers, the distant call of something across the valley too far away to identify. And beneath all of it, just at the edge of hearing something else. She was out of bed before she had made the decision to be. The sound was coming from the barn. Not distress exactly, or not the loud kind, not the sudden vocal protest of an injured animal. This was subtler than that. A restless, shifting equality of movement that was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate but couldn't ignore. Wren had grown up around animals. A cousin's farm summers spent learning the difference between the sounds of contentment and concealment, between a creature at ease and a creature performing ease for the benefit of observers. She pulled on her boots and coat and took the lantern from beside the door. The barn was dark and warm, smelling strongly of horse and hay, and the rich, complicated undercurrent of animals in close quarters. 6 stalls down the left side, 3 occupied. The first 2 horses, a bay mare and a young roan, shifted and settled as the lantern light reached them, the usual mild curiosity of stabled horses investigating a nighttime visitor. The third stall held a horse of a different order. He was a big gray gelding, easily 16 hands, with the kind of presence that filled a space and then overflowed it slightly. She could see immediately why he was the lead animal on this ranch. It was written in the way he carried himself, even in the confined space of the stall, in the way the other horses' attention angled toward him without their seeming to notice they were doing it. He was watching her with one dark eye, very still, the stillness of a creature that has decided to wait and see. She moved slowly. She kept the lantern low. She spoke to him in the low, unbroken murmur she had developed over years of approaching things that needed not to be startled. Not words, exactly, just tone and rhythm, just the sound of a human presence that meant no acceleration of harm. She ran her hand along his neck, his shoulder down his near foreleg. Found it. A heat there that shouldn't be barely detectable, yet the body beginning its quiet argument with something that had found its way in. Not crisis, not yet, but the early stages of what would become crisis if nothing intervened. She worked for the better part of an hour. What she needed she found in the barn's small supply chest. Not everything, but enough for now, enough to begin addressing what she had found. She moved efficiently in the dark, unhurried, pausing frequently to speak to the horse in that unbroken murmur, letting him track her by sound and learn that her movements near him resolved into relief rather than discomfort. By the time she returned to the house, the sky was beginning to go pale at the eastern edge. She washed her hands at the pump, the cold water shocking and clarifying, and stood for a moment in the yard looking back at the barn. She did not know she was being watched. She found out the following morning. She was in the kitchen, adding wood to the stove, when she heard the barn doors, and a few minutes later, Colt appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped there and looked at her. His expression had the same quality it had carried at the station, that deliberate suspension of reaction, but there was something additional in it now that she couldn't immediately categorize. "When did you go out to him?" he asked. Wren straightened. "A little after midnight. I heard something in the movement. I checked him before I turned in. Didn't see anything." "It was early," she said. "Easy to miss at that stage." Colt was quiet for a moment, studying her with that gray-green attention. "He's the lead horse. If he goes down—" "He won't," Wren said. "Not if it's managed from here." Another silence, longer this time. The kitchen held the warmth of the stove and the smell of the coffee she had started and the particular charged quality of a quiet that is deciding what to become. "I'll show you where the rest of the medical supplies are kept," Colt said finally. "After breakfast." It was not an expression of gratitude. It was something more considered than that, a recalibration, a small and deliberate opening of a door that had been shut for a long time. Wren understood that. She had spent years learning to read the language of people who communicated in adjustments rather than declarations. She turned back to the stove. "Coffee's ready," she said. He came in and sat at the table without being asked. And if that was not by conventional measure a dramatic moment, if it was merely a man sitting down for coffee in his own kitchen on an ordinary autumn morning, Wren felt the quiet weight of it nonetheless. She had been in this house less than 24 hours. She had arrived as a clause in a legal document, a solution to a problem, a name on a contract that had an ending already written into it. She had come here to be invisible, to take up just enough space to fulfill a function, and then dissolve quietly at the end of the agreed term. She had not expected anyone to look at her the way Colt Hawthorne had just looked at her in that kitchen doorway. Not with warmth. It was too early for warmth, the ground too frozen for that. But with something she recognized despite the years since she'd last encountered it. He had looked at her as though she was worth understanding. Wren set his coffee on the table. She sat across from him and wrapped her own cup in both hands and looked out the window at the pale gold morning coming over the hills of Ironwood. 12 months, the contract said. She thought for the first time since boarding the stagecoach that 12 months might turn out to be a more complicated measure of time than she had assumed. She did not let herself follow that thought any further. Not yet. Outside, the wind moved through the valley grass in long rolling waves, and the gray gelding in the barn stood steady in his stall. And the morning came on as mornings do, without permission, without promise, and entirely indifferent to the small human arrangements being made beneath its wide and impartial sky. 3 weeks passed the way early autumn passes in high country, quickly on the calendar, slowly in the body each day, carrying a quality of compressed light that made the hours feel both shorter and more significant than they had any right to be. Wren and Colt Hawthorne had arrived without discussion or negotiation at a kind of routine. It was the routine of two people who understood that proximity required structure, that living in close quarters with a stranger demanded the creation of small, predictable rhythms to replace the larger ones that weren't there yet. Breakfast at first light. The morning barn work divided without anyone having to divide it. The midday meal taken separately more often than not, each of them occupied with the particular demands of the season. Dinner in the kitchen when the light went brief and practical, the conversation limited to the business of the ranch. It was by most measures a functional arrangement. It was also by most measures extraordinarily careful. They moved around each other in the kitchen and the yard and the barn with the particular precision of two people who had learned through different histories that taking up too much space was a form of risk. Wren noticed things because noticing was what she did. She noticed that the firewood beside the kitchen door was always replenished before she needed to ask, always stacked tightly against the coming cold, with a thoroughness that suggested it had been done with some care. She noticed that the heaviest water buckets from the pump were never where she had left them in the morning, moved to a closer position by someone who hadn't announced the moving. She noticed that Colt, who ate without apparent preference at most meals, had paused almost imperceptibly the first morning she had put a particular spice into the cornbread, and that the spice had been waiting on the kitchen shelf in a fresh tin the following week, without a word said about it. He did not say he was paying attention. He demonstrated it through the accumulated evidence of small adjustments. She filed this away in the part of herself that was still cautious, the part that had learned to observe before concluding. But she filed it carefully, and she did not throw it away. It was midweek. She had begun marking the days in a small notebook she kept on the table in her room that Jerome Hawthorne came to call. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and then she saw him coming across the valley floor from the direction of the North Road, unhurried, a man who rode as though time was a commodity he had arranged in his favor. He was a compact man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and a face that had been handsome once and was now something more calculated, the features of a man who had learned to deploy pleasantness as a precision instrument. Colt was in the lower pasture when Jerome arrived, visible in the distance, but not within earshot. Jerome dismounted in the yard with the ease of a man arriving at a place he already considered his, in some important sense, tied his horse at the post, and turned to find Wren standing in the doorway of the barn. He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm, the kind of smile that required watching twice to notice it didn't extend all the way to where a real smile would reach. "You must be the new Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, moving toward her with his hat in his hand. "I'm Jerome, Colt's uncle." He paused. "I should have come sooner to welcome you properly. I hope you'll forgive the delay." "There's nothing to forgive," Wren said. He produced from behind him a bundle of late-season wildflowers he had apparently brought from somewhere, paper-wrapped, tied with a piece of twine, the kind of gesture that was either thoughtful or theatrical, depending on the person making it. "For the house," he said. "It could use a woman's touch. It always could." Wren took the flowers with both hands and thanked him without warmth or coldness, in the neutral register she had developed for situations that required more information before committing to a tone. She watched him the way she watched new animals, noting his movement, his attention, and the points where his performance of ease ran slightly ahead of what the moment actually called for. He stayed for the better part of an hour, talking pleasantly about the valley and the season and the particular challenges of ranching in the high country. He asked Wren with every appearance of genuine curiosity about her life before Ironwood. He listened to her abbreviated answers with the focused attention of a man cataloging information he intended to use later. And then, as Colt appeared at the far edge of the yard and began walking toward them, Jerome leaned slightly in Wren's direction and said quietly, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a warning wrapped in kindness, "You seem like a perceptive woman. I hope you find your footing here." A pause precisely timed. Sometimes people find themselves in situations that are more complicated than they were presented as being. When that happens, it's wise to remember that the wisest thing a person can do is look after themselves first. He straightened, smiled again. "Just one old man's opinion." Colt arrived. The conversation became general surface level, entirely unremarkable. Jerome left with the same unhurried pleasantness with which he had arrived. Wren stood in the yard after the sound of his horse had faded and turned Jerome's words over in her mind the way she turned over documents looking for the exact location of the leverage point, the place where the language did its real work. She found it quickly enough. It was not the warning itself. Warnings this gently delivered were rarely about safety. They were about positioning, about establishing an impression of benevolence before the favor was called in. Jerome had arrived at the Hawthorne Ranch and seen a woman who had come alone from somewhere else, who did not yet know the valley or its histories or the precise shape of what she had walked into. He had decided in the way of men accustomed to reading advantages that she might be useful to him. The flowers were still in her hand. She brought them inside and put them in a tin of water on the windowsill of the back hall where they would get the afternoon light and not be the first thing anyone saw when they walked through the kitchen door. They were flowers. They deserved water. But she was not going to place them where they could be interpreted as a welcome. She said nothing to Colt about it that evening. She was not ready to. There were things she needed to understand better before she brought them into a conversation, and besides, she had learned long ago that the instinct to share information quickly was not always wisdom. Sometimes it was only the need to redistribute the weight of knowing. She would carry this one alone for a little while longer. The calf arrived on a night that was colder than it should have been for the season, the temperature dropping with the abruptness of a high country weather that recognizes no obligation to transition gradually. Wren was not the one who noticed first. Colt came to her door in the middle of the night with a knock that had urgency in it without having panic. And when she opened it, he was already turning back toward the barn, already saying over his shoulder, "The Dunmore cow. She's early, and it's going wrong." She was pulling on her coat before he finished the sentence. The barn was lit with 2 lanterns, casting the warm amber light that made everything look slightly more serious and slightly more sacred than it did in daylight. The cow was in the large corner stall, already exhausted, already past the point of this being a straightforward matter. Colt crouched beside her with the efficient calm of a man who had done this before and knew the shape of what was needed, but the problem was immediately visible. A presentation that would require intervention, an intervention that would require hands smaller than his. He looked at Wren. She did not ask whether he was certain. She tied back her sleeves and knelt in the hay beside the animal and began working with the quiet, focused attention that had always come naturally to her in situations where there was something specific to be done and nothing to be gained from feeling the situation's difficulty too fully in the moment. She talked to the cow throughout. Not words exactly, or not only words, the same low continuous murmur she used with the horses, the sound of a human presence that was there to help rather than to demand. She could feel Colt watching her from the other side of the stall, not with the watching of a man assessing competence, so much as the watching of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and was trying to properly place. The calf arrived at 3:30 in the morning, small and dark, and breathing with the particular ferocity of a creature that has just come through something and is not prepared to concede to it. Wren sat back in the hay and watched the mother turn to her calf with the immediate total recognition of an animal who knows exactly what has just happened and felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for a long time. She heard it then, a sound she hadn't been expecting, a low exhale that in a different man might have been a laugh. She looked across the stall. Colt was sitting against the far wall, forearms resting on his knees, and in the lantern light, she could see that the rigid line of his jaw had, for the first time since she had arrived, released into something else entirely. It was not a full smile. It was the shadow of one private and unintentional, the expression of a man who had forgotten for a moment that he was performing composure. He looked up and found her looking. The expression shifted back, but not entirely, not all the way. A small remnant of it remained, like the warmth in a room after a fire has been banked. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. The market day in town happened on the last Friday of the month, and Colt mentioned it at breakfast the way he mentioned most things, briefly, practically without preamble. He needed to collect a supply order and settle an account with the farrier, and it was the kind of errand that required a wagon rather than a horse. And he supposed, with the particular careful neutrality of a man trying not to make an offer that would be interpreted as more than it was, that she might want to come along if she needed anything. Wren said she did. Ironwood Township was a single main street of modest ambitions, its buildings leaning slightly into one another, as though for warmth or solidarity. There was a general store, a farrier's, a small bank with a stone front that was clearly intended to communicate permanence, a feed supply, and a scattering of smaller establishments with hand-painted signs and window displays that spoke of limited stock and significant optimism. It was a working town, not a prospering one, and it wore that status without apology. They were noticed as Wren had known they would be. This was the kind of place where the arrival of a mail-order bride would be a matter of sustained communal interest, and she had prepared herself for it the way she prepared for most uncomfortable things, by deciding in advance not to be diminished by them. The women were thorough. They looked at her dress, which was plain and practical. They looked at her hands, which showed the beginnings of the work she had been doing. They looked at her beside Colt, calculating the visible distance between them, which was still considerable, and drawing conclusions she could see them drawing from the subtle adjustments in their expressions. And then one of them, a woman in a dark coat, with a confident bearing of someone accustomed to defining social parameters, asked the question. Asked it directly, pleasantly, with the unstudied cruelty of a person who does not recognize their pleasantness as a form of weapon. "Have you and Colt started a family yet, Mrs. Hawthorne?" The world did not stop. The street did not go quiet. It was only a question, one that had been asked of Wren in various forms, and by various people since the second year of her first marriage, and she knew its weight, and she knew its intention, and she had answered it many times, in many ways, some of which had cost her considerably. "Not yet," she said. It was the same answer she had always given. 2 words, even held without apology. She had learned this economy through practice, that elaboration invited further inquiry, that defense invited further assault, and that 2 words delivered without flinching had a quality of finality that more articulate responses rarely achieved. But the pause that followed was the particular pause of a woman receiving an answer she intended to keep using, and Wren felt the familiar cold weight of that pause settle somewhere between her shoulder blades. And then Colt was beside her. He had not come from far away. He had been at the supply counter not 8 feet from where she stood, and she had not realized he was within hearing. But he was beside her now, close enough that the sleeve of his coat just barely touched her shoulder, his presence shifting the geometry of the moment entirely. He did not say anything to the woman in the dark coat. He did not intervene or interject or perform any of the actions that would have drawn more attention to the moment. He simply stood there. It was the most deliberate thing he had done since she arrived, and they both knew it, and neither of them mentioned it as they walked back to the wagon with the supply order. She found the letter that evening. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for a spare candle in the small drawer of the writing desk in the main room. A desk she had not opened before, had not had occasion to open, and the letter was there tucked at the back beneath a ledger and a folded piece of survey paper. She recognized it for what it was, immediately a personal letter, old enough for the paper to have taken on the particular fragility of something that had been handled and replaced and handled again over years. She should have closed the drawer. She read the first 3 lines before she made herself stop, but those 3 lines were enough. The handwriting was a woman's. The tone was the tone of someone who had grieved the writing of every word. And the 3 lines she read before she folded the letter back and returned it to exactly where she had found it were these: "You never asked me to stay. I waited for so long for that question, and it never came. I want you to know that I would have stayed, Colt, if you had only asked." Wren closed the drawer. She stood with her hands flat on the surface of the desk and looked at the wall for a long moment. She thought about the 2 words she had said that afternoon on the street. Not yet. She thought about what it meant to wait for a question that never came. She thought about the specific practiced silence of a man who communicated through adjustments rather than declarations through firewood and moved water buckets and a tin of spice on a kitchen shelf. A man who showed what he felt in every way except the direct one who had apparently loved someone enough to grieve her for years, and had still not found the capacity to simply open his mouth and ask. She thought about the contract on the table in her room with its 12-month clause and its careful language and its exit already written into it from the first page. She did not find a candle. She went to bed without one and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind move through the valley, and did not quite sleep and did not quite not sleep, and thought about the shape of the people who ended up answering mail-order advertisements, and the shape of the people who placed them, and the strange specific loneliness that produced both. The week after the market day, Jerome Hawthorne returned. He did not come to the house this time. Wren saw him from the upper pasture, where she had been checking the water levels in the stone trough, saw him arrive at the yard, saw Colt come out of the barn, saw the 2 men stand in the yard in the low afternoon light with the posture of a conversation that was not comfortable. She was too far away to hear. She could read the shapes of things, though. Jerome's gestures easy and expansive. Colt's stillness, which was the stillness of a man containing something rather than feeling nothing. And then Jerome's departure, the same unhurried pleasantness, the same horse moving away at a gentle walk as though there was nothing in the world to hurry for. Colt stood in the yard after Jerome left and did not move for a long time. Wren watched him from the pasture and did not go down. There was nothing to go down for, yet nothing she could offer that would help, because she didn't have enough pieces yet to know what shape the help needed to take. But that night, after dinner, when Colt had sat for a moment longer than usual at the kitchen table, before pushing back his chair, Wren said, "He came about the will." Colt stopped. He looked at her across the table. "Opal told me the general shape of things." Wren said, "You don't have to explain what you don't want to, but I'm not unaware of what's at stake here." Something in his face shifted, not opening exactly, but the thing that is just before opening, the moment when a door that has been locked for a long time recognizes a key that might fit. He sat back down. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. He had a solicitor send papers this week, Colt said. questioning whether the marriage meets the conditions of the will, whether it constitutes a genuine union. He said the last two words with a flatness that contained underneath it the specific humiliation of having the authenticity of one's own life subjected to external review. Wren looked at him steadily. What did the papers say specifically? That there are witnesses prepared to testify that the arrangement is contractual in nature, that there is no evidence of a shared life in the ordinary sense. He paused. They're not wrong, technically. No. Wren said, not technically. The silence that followed was different from their previous silences, less the silence of two careful people maintaining distance, more the silence of two people standing at the edge of something and looking down at it together. We have time, Wren said finally, if we're seen together more. If there are people who can speak to what they've actually observed rather than what can be theorized. She kept her voice practical because that was the register he responded to the language of problems that had solutions rather than feelings that required navigation. It doesn't change what this is, but it changes what it looks like to people who are looking for reasons to make claims. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, all right. It was not agreement to anything beyond what had been explicitly proposed, but Wren heard in it the same quality she had heard in his voice that first morning in the kitchen when he had told her where the medical supplies were kept. The sound of a door opening, cautious and deliberate, just enough to let in some air. She gathered the dinner plates and brought them to the basin and told herself that this was a practical development in a practical arrangement, and that the warmth she felt at the back of her sternum was simply the wood stove doing its job. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the first real bite of the season, the cold that comes to stay rather than to visit. Wren looked out the window at the darkness over the valley and thought about Jerome's careful smile and the letter in the desk drawer and the way Colt had stood beside her on the street without saying a single word. 12 months, the contract said. Wren was beginning to suspect that the contract had been wrong about the math from the beginning, that some things could not be measured in months at all, that they accumulated instead in the spaces between moments in firewood and moved buckets, and two people sitting at a table in the dark, deciding slowly and without announcement that the other one was worth the risk of staying. She did not say any of this. She dried the plates and hung the cloth by the stove, and said good night in the ordinary way, and went to her room and locked the door out of habit rather than necessity, and lay in the dark listening to the wind carry the first real cold across the valley floor. The gray gelding was doing well. She checked him every morning now, and every morning he turned at the sound of her step in the barn, not with the bright, indiscriminate attention of a horse that greets everyone, but with the particular focused recognition of an animal that has categorized a person and placed them on the side of the ledger marked trustworthy. Wren put her hand against his neck each morning and felt his steady warmth, and thought that this at least was unambiguous. This was a thing she understood clearly and could rely on the simple, uncomplicated arithmetic of a creature that had been helped and remembered it. She had started to think of him as a kind of measure of things. In the first days when everything about Ironwood was strange and uncertain, and she had moved through the ranch with the careful efficiency of someone who knows they are on probation, he had watched her with interest, but withheld judgment. Then gradually, over the course of morning after morning, treatment after treatment, the low, unbroken murmur she kept up while she worked on his leg, he had shifted from watchful to willing, from willing to trusting, from trusting to the easy companionship of the present where he simply recognized the sound of her and turned toward it. She was aware that she had been doing something similar. She was aware that Colt Hawthorne, who had not asked her in and had been trying in his own careful way to make the terms of the arrangement clear from the first moment, had somehow become the person she oriented toward when she came into a room. That she noticed his absence when he was in the field and his presence when he came back. That she had, without deciding to, started reading the rhythms of his day, the way she read the rhythms of the valley, not with effort, simply by living in it long enough for the patterns to become familiar. Everything else she was still working out. The water line broke on a night that had no business being as cold as it was. There had been no warning, or rather there had been the kind of warning that only becomes legible in retrospect, the particular quality of silence that precedes a pipe giving way the stillness in the air that a person might notice and file away as nothing, and later remember with the specific regret of hindsight. Wren woke to the sound of it at some point past midnight, a low persistent rushing that was wrong in the way all water sounds wrong when it is going somewhere it was not intended to go. She found Colt already in the yard when she came out, lantern in hand, moving toward the side of the house where the main supply line ran underground from the hillside cistern. The ground there was torn open, frost heave. He said the kind of thing that happened when the temperature dropped too fast and the earth moved before the line could accommodate it. The water was spreading across the yard in a dark fan, already beginning to ice at the edges where it met the frozen air. They worked in near total silence for the better part of 2 hours. It was not the comfortable quiet they had built over the preceding weeks, the easy wordlessness of two people who had stopped needing to fill space between them. This was the silence of focused labor of hands occupied with cold iron fittings and waterlogged earth, and the particular physical problem of a repair that needed to be done correctly or done again. Wren held the lantern where it was needed. She passed tools without being asked because she had been watching long enough to understand the sequence of what he was doing and could anticipate the next step by one. When the fitting required a second set of hands to hold tension while the seal was set, she was already there before he said it. The cold was serious by the time they finished. Not the brisk cold of early autumn, but something with intent in it, pressing down on the valley from the ridgelines with the patient authority of a season that had been waiting its turn. Wren's hands, even through her gloves, had gone from painful to numb to the strange false warmth that meant she needed to get inside. They stood in the kitchen afterward with a particular exhausted stillness of people who have just finished something difficult together. Colt built the fire back up without speaking. Wren boiled water and made 2 cups of something hot, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with their hands wrapped around the cups and the warmth coming back slowly into their fingers and the night pressing at the windows from outside. "It'll hold," Colt said. He was looking at his hands, flexing the stiffness out of them. "It'll hold." Wren agreed. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was finding the gaps in the eaves, producing a thin, high sound that would have been lonely in different company. Colt set his cup down. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has something to say and is determining the correct approach to saying it. Then he said, "My brother, half-brother, technically, Daniel. He worked this land for a few years when we were younger, after our father died before I got the title clear." A pause. Jerome tried to contest the inheritance then too. Daniel held him off while I was dealing with other things. He was better at confrontation than I was. Something shifted in his face, private and brief. He moved on eventually. Got his own land south of here. But he learned this valley the same way I did, from the ground up, from the animals outward. He looked up at her. He would have liked watching you work. Wren held her cup and looked at him steadily and waited, because she understood that this was not the beginning of a story. It was something he had been carrying for a while, that had found in the cold dark and the shared exhaustion a moment to put down briefly. "He died 3 seasons back," Colt said. "Fever, the kind that comes fast." He said it in the flat tone of a man who has said the sentence enough times to have worn the immediate pain off it, leaving only the permanent dull weight underneath. "I wasn't there when it happened. I was here managing the land, doing the thing I always do." He picked up his cup again. He did not say anything further, and Wren understood that he was not precisely telling her about Daniel. He was telling her about himself, about the man who had stayed and worked and maintained and managed, and who had been here doing those things when people he loved had needed something different from him. The fire settled in the grate. The sound of it filled the silence without crowding it. Wren looked at the side of Colt's face, the angle of jaw and cheekbone she had come to know, in the way you come to know the geography of a place you walk through every day, not by examining it, but simply by moving through it until its shapes have become part of your own interior map. She saw in the slight tightening around his eye the thing he had not said, that he was still here, still managing, still doing the thing he always did, that the land was standing, that Daniel was gone, that these two facts lived side by side in him without resolving. She understood this particular grief, not the grief of loss exactly, but the grief of having been present in the wrong way, of having given what you knew how to give instead of what was needed. She had spent 8 months in a boarding house room, coming to terms with her own version of it. She set her cup down. "When my husband died," she said, "his family came to the house within the week." She looked at the surface of the table, the scored and seasoned wood of it, the marks of years of use. "Not to grieve with me, to assess." She said the word with the same flatness he had used for his. "The house, the accounts, the question of whether there were children." A brief pause. "There were not. There never had been." She looked up at the window, at the darkness beyond it. His mother used a specific word. I had heard it before from others, but she said it in a particular way, as a verdict rather than a description, as something settled and official. She paused. "Barren." The fire shifted and settled in the grate. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves and found them. "They took the house," she said, "legally, cleanly. I had very little standing." She said this without bitterness, with the same accuracy with which she said everything, noting the fact of it, the mechanism of it, without performing a feeling about it either way. "I spent 8 months afterward in a room in a boarding house, taking in whatever work I could find and trying to determine whether I was angry or ashamed or neither." A pause. "I believe I was mostly tired." She looked at him then, and he was looking at her, and the kitchen held them both in its warm light, with the quality of a space that has just been trusted with something significant, and is quietly accepting the weight of that trust. "I don't know if the word was right," Wren said. "I never let myself think about it too carefully, because thinking about it carefully required accepting it as the defining fact of my life, and I declined to do that." Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming more precise. "I chose this." She gestured slightly at the room, the window, the valley beyond it. "Not because I had no other options, because this one looked honest. The contract was honest. The terms were honest." She picked up her cup again. I find I can work with honest. Colt was quiet for a long time. The fire settled again. Wren could hear the gray gelding moving in the barn, the easy shift of a horse comfortable in his stall. Adeline, Colt said. Just the name placed carefully, like something he rarely took out into the air. Wren did not react with anything that could be read as recognition, though she recognized the name from the letter she had found, and returned to its drawer without a word. She came here with me when I first took on the ranch, he said. Stayed 2 winters. The 3rd winter she left. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. She told me afterward in a letter that she had waited for me to ask her to stay, that she would have if I had. He set the cup down. I knew she was unhappy. I could see it. I told myself that what I was doing, keeping the land running, keeping us solvent, building something worth having, that was the same as asking. That showing her the work was the same as showing her I wanted her in it. He looked at his hands. It wasn't the same. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences that had preceded it, not the silence of people maintaining safe distance, but the silence of 2 people who have without planning to found themselves standing in the same room of their own interior landscape and have discovered with some surprise that the rooms are not entirely unlike. We're very different in how we fail, Wren said finally. Colt looked at her. You don't say the thing, she said. I don't argue with the thing that said, different directions, same destination. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, and not one. It was the expression Wren thought of a person who has just been understood in a way that is both a relief and a slight disruption to their idea of themselves. He did not respond to that, but he refilled her cup without asking, and she let him, and they sat for another while in the warm dark, and neither of them said anything further, and it was in its way one of the most articulate conversations Wren had ever had. Jerome's second move came through official channels, as all his moves seemed to. A letter arrived from a solicitor, formal, precise, the language of a document that had been written by someone paid to build a wall out of words. It requested that Colt appear before a panel of local assessors to answer questions about the nature of the marriage. It cited a clause in the original will that allowed for such a review if cause was presented, and it listed as the cause the testimony of a Mrs. Vera Holloway, a name that meant nothing to Colt, who said so flatly when he read it at the breakfast table. It meant something to Wren. She did not show this immediately. She kept her face in the register she had learned to maintain when information arrived that required processing before response, and she finished her breakfast and helped clear the table. And it was only when Colt had gone out to the yard that she stood at the kitchen window for a long moment with her hand pressed flat against the glass, and let herself feel the cold of it. Vera Holloway was the name of the woman who had been her late husband's family solicitor's personal secretary. A woman who had sat in the room during the settlement, who had heard every word spoken there, who had been present when the verdict was delivered. A woman who was apparently willing to travel a considerable distance to offer testimony about the domestic and personal history of a widow she had met on 3 occasions in the context of a legal proceeding. Jerome had done his research thoroughly and without mercy. Opal came that afternoon, as she periodically did with bread and information in roughly equal measure. She sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on and her coffee going cold at her elbow because she was talking too quickly to drink it, and she told Wren what she had heard from her nephew, who worked at the assessor's office, that Jerome had arranged the review for 2 weeks' time and had also, in the same week, had a second meeting with the representatives from the land company. He's not waiting anymore, Opal said. He was patient when he thought time was on his side. Something has changed. She looked at Wren directly. He's seen that this isn't what he expected it to be. Wren looked at her. The two of you, Opal said with the matter-of-fact clarity of a woman who had watched people for 60 years and had stopped pretending not to see things. Whatever it was when you arrived, it shifted. Anyone with eyes can see it. Jerome has eyes. Wren looked at her coffee. It's still a contract, she said. Most things start as contracts. Opal said with the serenity of a woman entirely unbothered by being right. That doesn't determine what they become. She left an hour later, and in the quiet after her departure, Wren sat at the kitchen table and thought about what Opal had said about Jerome seeing things shifting, about a man who had been patient, deciding the ground was moving under him and accelerating his plans. She thought about the records Opal had mentioned in passing weeks ago, the documents from Jerome's dealings with the land company kept in part at the assessor's office and in part in Jerome's own files. Opal had mentioned this in the same tone she mentioned most things casual and thorough, the tone of a woman who stores information against the day it will be needed and is waiting to see when that day comes. Wren began quietly to plan. She said nothing about it to Colt. Not yet. She was not ready to bring him into it until she understood the full shape of what she was building, because bringing someone into a half-finished thing was how half-finished things got broken. Instead, she began appearing at the assessor's office in town on her market day trips, with questions that were individually unremarkable, questions about land registry records, about the history of property transfers in the valley, about the filing requirements for contesting a will provision. She asked them in the tone of a curious new resident acquainting herself with the workings of the community. The clerk, a young man named Aldous, who was pleased to have his expertise consulted, answered them at length. She began keeping a second notebook, not the one on her bedside table where she marked the days, a different one with a different quality of information in it. The afternoon with the candy happened as most significant things in her experience happened without any apparent significance at the time. They had come to town together, as had become their custom since the conversation about Jerome's challenge to the will. The supply order was straightforward, the farrier visit brief. They were finishing at the general store, Colt paying the account at the counter while Wren moved along the shelves making the last few additions to the order when the first cold rain of the season began against the windows with no warning whatsoever. By the time they were done inside, the rain was serious, not the kind that would stop in 5 minutes and leave the air clean, but the kind that had settled in for the afternoon with complete indifference to anyone's plans. They stood under the roof of the general store's covered porch and looked at it side by side, their shoulders almost touching in the narrow space. Colt went back inside briefly. When he returned, he held out his hand. In his palm was a piece of wrapped hard candy, the kind kept in a glass jar on the supply counter. Butterscotch by the color of the wrapper. Wren looked at it, then at him. "You always look at the jar when we're at the counter," he said, not defensively. As a statement of observed fact delivered by a man who had apparently been noting this for some time, and had simply decided in this particular moment to do something about it. Wren took the candy. She did not open it immediately. She held it in her gloved palm and looked out at the rain moving across the street in gray curtains and felt beneath the practical wool of her coat something warm and entirely disproportionate to the occasion of a single piece of butterscotch candy moving through the air from one hand to another. She put it in her pocket. He did not ask why she didn't eat it. She did not explain. They stood there in companionable quiet until the rain eased enough to make the drive reasonable, and then they went to the wagon and drove back through the washed and glittering valley without saying anything in particular, and Wren's hand rested against her coat pocket for most of the journey home. It was Opal who finally told her the full extent of what Jerome had arranged. She came on a morning when the sky was doing something complicated with clouds, and the light had the flat, particular quality of a day that had not yet decided what it intended to become. She did not bring bread this time. She came with a face that was not worried. Exactly, Opal was not apparently a woman given to worry, but that was carrying something with more weight to it than her usual visits. She told Wren about the land company's plans in terms that were not uncertain. Not just the Hawthorne land, the Prentice family's grazing fields, the McGrew widow's water access without which her land was worthless for any practical purpose, the Lund brothers' lower pasture which lay along the creek, the same water that kept the eastern half of the valley alive through dry seasons. Jerome's arrangement, if it went through, would not leave the valley damaged. It would leave it functionally destroyed, as a place where ordinary people could make a life from the ground. "There are records," Opal said. "I've seen some of them, not all." The arrangement was made in two parts. One part through the public filing system, one part through Jerome's private dealings. The private part is the part that shows the full picture. She looked at Wren with the particular clarity of a woman arriving at the point she came to make. Someone with patience and a good eye for documents might be able to bring those pieces together. Wren looked at her steadily. "How long would that take?" "Weeks," Opal said. "Done carefully." "Weeks," Wren repeated. They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the understanding of two women who have both through different paths arrived at the place where what is right and what is possible have finally intersected. "I'll need access to the public filings," Wren said, "through Aldous at the assessor's office. I've already established a reason to be there." "I have letters," Opal said, "from when Jerome first approached the Prentice family 3 seasons back. They didn't understand what they were being shown. I kept copies." She paused. "I keep most things." "I know," Wren said, and for the first time in the conversation, something moved across her face that was not calculation or assessment, but something warmer, something that looked briefly like the particular relief of a person who has found in an unexpected place an ally who has been waiting as long as they have. "Don't tell Colt yet," Wren said. Opal raised an eyebrow. "When I bring him into it," Wren said, "I want to bring him the whole thing, not a half-built case and a theory." She looked at the window at the complicated sky outside. "He deserves to know what he's actually dealing with, not pieces of it." Opal nodded slowly with the expression of a woman who sees the sense in this, but is reserving the right to have opinions about the pace of it. After she left, Wren sat at the kitchen table for a long time with her second notebook open in front of her and the house quiet around her. Outside, the valley was doing what it always did, existing with its magnificent indifference, the grass moving and the creek running, and the ridge lines holding their positions against the sky as though they had been placed there with specific intent. She thought about Colt in the barn at this moment, working with the same steady attention he brought to every physical task, the man who showed what he felt through maintenance and adjustment and quiet presence, rather than declaration. She thought about the letter in the desk drawer, and the word he hadn't been able to say to Adeline, and the night beside the water pipe in the cold dark. when he had told her about Daniel, and she had told him about the word that had been used as a verdict. She thought about a 12-month contract and an exit written into it from the first page. Then she opened her notebook to a clean page and uncapped her pen and began to write in her precise and careful hand the first entry in what would become the most important document she had ever produced. Outside, the sky made its decision. The clouds broke, and the afternoon light came through in long golden shafts, and the valley received it the way the valley received everything completely, and without asking where it came from. The hearing was held in the largest room of the township hall, which was not a large room. It had been built for community functions, harvest dinners, the occasional traveling lecture, the kind of modest civic gatherings that punctuated the rhythm of a working valley. Today it held 3 assessors behind a long table at the front, a scattering of townspeople who had come partly out of civic interest and partly out of the particular human draw toward a proceeding that promised to be uncomfortable for someone, and at a smaller table to the left, Jerome Hawthorne's solicitor, a thin man named Graves, who had the practiced stillness of someone paid to project certainty. Wren sat beside Colt on a plain wooden bench near the front. She had dressed carefully that morning, not to perform, but because she understood that appearance was a form of argument in rooms like this one, and she intended to make every argument available to her. Her coat was her best one dark wool, well-maintained. Her hair was put up with the precision of someone who knew that the details of a woman's presentation were read as evidence of her character in ways that the details of a man's never were. She had not slept well, not because she was afraid exactly, but because the night before a difficult thing, there was always this particular quality of sleeplessness, not panic, simply the mind running and running over the terrain it would have to cross, making sure it knew every step. Colt had not slept either. She had heard him moving in the main room well past midnight, the low sound of boots on floorboards, the occasional scrape of the chair. She had not gone out. There was nothing she could have offered at that hour that would have helped, and she had learned that offering things that couldn't help was its own kind of intrusion. The hearing began with procedural formalities delivered by the senior assessor in the tone of someone who had presided over enough of these proceedings to have the language memorized. The nature of the challenge to the will provision. The question before the panel. The evidence to be presented. And then Mrs. Vera Holloway was called. She was a neat woman in her 50s, well-dressed in the manner of someone who considered presentation a form of moral statement. She took her seat with the composed bearing of a person who has told herself that what she is about to do is simply a matter of honest testimony, that telling a true thing cannot be wrong, regardless of the purpose to which the truth is being put. She spoke clearly and precisely. She described the settlement proceedings after the death of Wren's late husband. She described the nature of the discussions. She described the findings with regard to the marriage and its issue using the clinical language of legal documentation in a way that made the clinical language feel worse than cruelty, because it dressed itself in the appearance of neutrality. And then she used the word. She did not use it cruelly. She used it in the same tone she used every other word evenly, precisely as though it were simply the accurate term for a category of fact, which made it in some ways considerably worse than cruelty would have been. Wren heard it land in the room the way she always heard it land, not as sound, but as something that traveled through the air and arrived in the body. She felt the familiar cold weight of it settle between her shoulder blades. She kept her face still. She had kept her face still for this word in worse rooms than this one in front of people with far less goodwill toward her than even the most skeptical person in this hall. She knew how to hold still for it. What she had not calculated for was Colt. She felt him go rigid beside her. Not visibly, he did not move, did not make a sound, did not do anything that could be observed by anyone not sitting close enough to feel the change in the quality of his stillness. But she felt it the way you feel a change in temperature, and she understood that he had heard the word the way it was intended to be heard, as a verdict settled and official, and that something in him had tightened in response to it with a force that surprised her. She waited for him to say something, to lean toward her or touch her arm or in some way indicate that he understood what had just been done and was with her in the receiving of it. He did not. He sat still in the particular way he sat still when he was containing something, the rigid line of his jaw, the hands flat on his thighs, the eyes forward. Processing, she understood intellectually. That was what he was doing. He was receiving information and processing it in the internal way he processed everything, the same way he showed care through maintenance, rather than declaration through adjustments, rather than words. She understood it intellectually. It did not reach the place in her where the word had just landed. The hearing continued. Jerome's solicitor made his arguments in the measured, reasonable tones of a man who had constructed his case carefully and knew it. The three assessors asked their questions. Colt answered some of them in his flat, practical voice with the accuracy of a man who does not embellish, because embellishment requires a kind of creative self-promotion that is entirely foreign to him. Wren answered the questions directed at her in the same register she had used on the street that day with the woman who had asked about children. Even, unelaborated. Each answer was its own small act of refusal to be diminished. But the whole time, the cold weight sat between her shoulder blades. And the space beside her, where she had come to understand a kind of presence, even in silence, felt different. Now felt like the old kind of silence again, the early kind, the silence of two people maintaining safe distance, because neither of them knew how to bridge it. The assessors would deliberate and provide a determination within the week. The hearing adjourned. People began to move around them, the particular low conversational hum of a room returning to ordinary life after a moment of difficulty. Colt stood. He looked at her briefly, directly, genuinely, with an expression she could not read, because it had too many things in it at once, and she was too tired to sort through them. "You held up well," he said. It was the kind of thing a man says when he means well, and does not have the words for what he actually means. Wren knew this. She had spent enough time with his language to understand the translation. But she was very tired, and the word was still sitting between her shoulder blades, and a person can understand the translation of something, and still find in the moment of receiving it that the translation is not enough. "Thank you," she said. She gathered her coat and walked out of the township hall into the cold afternoon air and breathed it in, and told herself she was fine. She was, in fact, very much not fine. She did not make dinner that evening. She went to her room at mid-afternoon on the pretext of a headache, which was not entirely untrue. There was a headache, a real one, the kind that arrives after the body has been held tense for several hours and finally releases. She lay on her bed with the quilt pulled up and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel in the privacy of the small room with its locked door the full weight of what the day had been. It was not the hearing itself. She had survived worse scrutinies than a panel of 3 Valley assessors. It was not even the word precisely. She had heard it enough times to know its exact dimensions, to have mapped its territory. It was the space beside her, the silence that had arrived when she needed something from it and had found it absent. She thought about the letter in the desk drawer. "You never asked me to stay." She thought about Adeline and the question that never came. She thought about a man who communicated through firewood and moved water buckets and a piece of butterscotch candy on a rainy afternoon, who showed everything in the peripheral language of action and showed nothing in the direct language of words, because the direct language required a kind of openness that he had apparently never found his way to. She had known this from the beginning. She had read the letter and understood it, and had thought with the particular confidence of a person who believes their own clarity of perception will protect them, that she was not Adeline, that she was not waiting for a question, that she had arrived with a contract and a practical arrangement and no expectation of anything beyond what was written. She had been wrong about what she was waiting for. She had simply not known it until today, in the moment when the waiting became visible through its absence. Wren got up. She went to the small table, and she picked up her copy of the contract, the one she kept there folded into its precise rectangle, the one she had read on the stagecoach months ago. She looked at the final clause, 12 months. She put it back down. She got her coat, her bag, her one traveling case that had come with her from the East. She did not pack everything. She did not have enough things for packing everything to be a dramatic gesture. She packed what she needed. She moved quietly. She wrote on a piece of paper in her careful hand one sentence: "I did not come here to be a solution to a problem." She left it on the kitchen table, waited under the salt cellar. She left the contract beside it, her copy, the one that had traveled against her ribs all the way from the East. And then she walked out of the Hawthorne Ranch in the late gray afternoon with her bag in her right hand and her chin at a height she had practiced, and walked the 20 minutes to Opal Briggs's house over the East Ridge. Opal opened the door before Wren had reached the porch steps, as though she had been expecting this, or something like this, for longer than Wren had been expecting it herself. She did not ask questions. She simply stood back and let Wren in, took her coat, put her in the chair nearest the fire, and put a kettle on, without a word. They sat in Opal's kitchen, which was entirely unlike Colt's kitchen, cluttered with the evidence of a life fully inhabited, plants in the windows, a cat on the hearth, the accumulated comfortable disorder of a woman who had made her peace with her own presence decades ago. And Wren drank her tea and looked at the fire and said very little. Opal said less, which was unusual for Opal, and which was, Wren thought, the most generous thing she could have offered. Later, she did not know how much later, the fire had burned lower. Wren said, "I keep making the same mistake." Opal looked at her. "I decide I have no expectations," Wren said. "And then I discover that I do. And then something happens. And I find out exactly what they were by the shape of the space they leave when they're not met." She looked at the fire. It would be more honest to admit the expectations from the beginning. It would. Opal agreed. "I expected him to say something today." She said it carefully, accurately, the way she said everything. Not anything elaborate, just something. Something that acknowledged what had been done in that room, and that I had been the person it was done to. She paused. "He said I held up well." Opal was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That man has been speaking a language with no words in it for 40 years. He does not become fluent overnight because the occasion calls for it." "I know," Wren said. "I know that." She pressed her palms against her thighs the way she always did when she was ordering herself. Knowing it doesn't make it hurt less. No. Opal said with the simplicity of a woman who had stopped pretending otherwise about the nature of pain. It doesn't. Wren stayed in the spare room. She lay in the unfamiliar dark and thought about the second notebook she had left in her room at Ironwood, the one with weeks of careful documentation in it. She thought about how close she was to having what she needed. She thought about Jerome and the assessors and the word that had been used as a verdict and the thin solicitor named Graves with his wall of careful language. She thought about Colt in the kitchen finding the note, finding the contract beside it. She was not, she told herself, waiting. She was resting. There was a difference. Colt came at 11 o'clock that night. She knew it was him by the knock, the same quality of knock as the night of the difficult, calving urgency, without panic, the knock of a man who has a reason and is prepared to wait for a response, but is not prepared to leave without one. Opal's voice at the front door, low and uninflected. A pause. Then a single, quiet knock at the door of the spare room. Wren sat up. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and went to the door and opened it. He was standing in the narrow hallway with his hat in his hands, and he looked in the low light of Opal's spare candle like a man who had spent the last several hours running himself against the edges of something and had finally decided to stop running and simply stand still and face it. He did not speak immediately. She waited. "I read the note," he said. She held the door frame and looked at him. "You're right," he said. It came out the way things came out of him when he had worked to get them to the surface, direct stripped of all unnecessary material, the essential thing and nothing else. You are not a solution to a problem. You were never that. I knew that. And I didn't say it. And I should have said it today, especially. And I did not. He stopped. His hands on the hat brim were not entirely steady. I sat in that room, and I heard what was said. And another pause. Longer. The pause of a man who has arrived at the place where the language runs out and is having to build new terrain. I wanted to say something. I could not find the words fast enough, and then the moment was past, and then I had said the wrong thing instead. And I knew it was wrong when I said it, and I said it anyway, because I did not know what else to say. The candlelight moved in the draft from somewhere in the house. Outside, the valley was completely dark. The sky overhead, very clear and very cold. The stars hard and bright as struck flint. "I know," Wren said quietly. "That is not sufficient," Colt said. She looked at him. "Knowing that I know is not sufficient," he said. "It does not fix the thing I did, which was to sit next to you in that room and say nothing when nothing was the worst possible response." He looked at her directly with the gray-green attention she had come to understand was his version of complete openness. "You told me weeks ago that I fail by not saying the thing. You were right. I knew you were right. I have been attempting to—" He stopped, started again. "I have been attempting to do differently. I am not fluent in it yet." It was Wren thought the most words she had ever heard him say consecutively. And they were not the right words, not in the way that a speech is the right speech crafted and landed and received with the satisfaction of a well-made thing. They were the words of a man emptying his pockets in public, laying out everything he had, and acknowledging that what he had was imperfect and inadequate and offered anyway, because it was all there was. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." He came in ducking slightly for the door frame. He sat in the chair by the fire, and she made the tea, and they sat across from each other in Opal's cluttered kitchen with the fire burning low and the cat observing them from the hearth with the supreme indifference of a creature that has already seen everything. "I'm not going back tonight," Wren said. I need one night that is mine." She said it carefully as a fact and not an accusation. Not the ranch, not the contract. One night that belongs only to me. "All right," Colt said. "But I'm coming back in the morning," she said, "because I have work to finish." He looked at her. "The documents." She met his eyes. "It's time I told you the full shape of what I've found." Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who has suspected for some time that the woman across from him has been carrying more than he knew, and has been waiting with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for her to be ready to set it down. "I'm listening," Colt Hawthorne said. And Wren Calloway, who had come to Ironwood to disappear, who had arrived with one traveling case and a contract with an exit written into it, and no intention of expecting anything from anyone, took a slow breath and began to tell him everything. Outside the valley held its cold and magnificent silence. The stars burned. The grass was still. And in the warm, cluttered kitchen of Opal Briggs's house on the East Ridge, two people who had each in their own way arrived at the edge of the same territory, sat across from each other, and began finally to speak the same language. She told him everything. Not in the compressed, efficient way she told most things, not the version edited for the comfort of the listener or shaped to land without causing unnecessary alarm. She told him the full shape of it, from Opal's first conversation in the kitchen weeks ago to the second notebook, and the hours at the assessor's office, and the letters Opal had kept from 3 seasons back when Jerome first approached the Prentice family. She laid it out the way she laid out documentation in sequence, with the evidence attached, with the connections between pieces made explicit rather than assumed. Colt listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that his silence during a conversation was not absence, but the opposite of absence, a form of complete attention that most people express through noise, and he expressed through stillness. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on her face, and he took in everything she said with the focused quality of a man building something in his mind as the materials arrived. When she finished, the fire had burned considerably lower, and the tea had gone cold. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How close are you?" Not a question exactly, an assessment. "Close," she said. "The public filings establish the framework. What I still need are the private records, the correspondence between Jerome and the company that shows the arrangement predates your father's death. Opal has some of it. There are pieces at the assessor's office that Aldous hasn't realized are relevant yet because he doesn't have the full picture." She paused. "With another week, possibly less, I can put together something a proper panel could not set aside." Colt looked at the fire. The muscle in his jaw moved. Not tension, exactly the particular quality of a man processing something that is reshaping his understanding of a situation he thought he understood. "He arranged the provision in the will," Colt said. It was not a question. He was saying it aloud to hear how it sounded in the air outside his own mind. "The evidence points to it," Wren said carefully. "I cannot say it with certainty yet. In a week, I can." He stood up. Not with agitation, he moved the way he always moved, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided on a direction. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark valley for a moment, and Wren watched him from across the room and thought about what it meant to learn that a thing you had been fighting to hold was, in its original terms, a trap that had been set specifically for you. My father, Colt said, was not a complicated man. He was careful, and he was fair, and he wanted the land to stay in the family. He paused. He trusted Jerome because Jerome was his brother. That's all it was. Another pause longer. Jerome knew exactly how much my father trusted him. Wren did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would help, and she had learned from him that silence could be its own form of solidarity. Colt turned from the window. He looked at her across the small room with the gray-green attention that she had come to understand meant he was saying something important, regardless of whether words were involved. "Thank you," he said, "for doing this." "I did it for the valley," Wren said, because that was true. Because she needed it to be clear that she had not done it as a performance of devotion or a bid for something, that she had done it because it was the right thing to be done, and she was the person who could do it. The Prentice family, the McGrew widow, the Lund brothers. They don't know what's coming for them. "I know," Colt said, "but you could have left this morning and the valley would have found out another way eventually. You didn't." He held her gaze. "You came back." She had not, in fact, officially come back yet. She was still in Opal's spare room, in Opal's kitchen in the middle of the night. But she understood what he meant, and she did not correct the technical inaccuracy. "I told you I was coming back in the morning," she said. "You did," he said. They looked at each other across the small, warm room, and something in the air between them had the quality of a thing that has been stretched very tight for a long time, and has finally, very carefully been allowed to go slack. Not released, simply no longer held against its own weight. Colt left at midnight. He walked back across the ridge in the dark, and Wren stood at the window of Opal's spare room and watched the lantern he carried until it disappeared over the crest of the hill, and then she went to bed and slept for the first time in several weeks without waking. The final week was the most concentrated work Wren had done since she arrived. She went to the assessor's office every day with questions that had by now become familiar enough to Aldous that he brought out the relevant ledgers before she finished asking for them. She sat at the long table with the morning light coming through the high windows and worked through the filings with the patience of someone who has done this kind of work long enough to understand that the important document is almost always the unremarkable one, the one that was filed without fanfare, because the person filing it did not want to draw attention to it. She found it on a gray, still morning. It was a land survey filing, dry and technical, and buried between two routine property registrations from the same season. It referenced an agreement, not the agreement itself, but the existence of one between a private party, identified by a company name, and a second party, whose initial filing address matched Jerome Hawthorne's known correspondence address. The date on the filing was 3 months before the death of Reginald Hawthorne. Wren sat with this document for a long time. She read it 4 times. She copied it in full into her notebook in her careful hand. Then she sat back and looked at the high window and the pale sky beyond it, and felt the quiet, particular satisfaction of a thing clicking into its correct position after a long effort. She brought it to Opal that afternoon. Opal read it twice, looked up and said, "That's it. That's it." Wren agreed. They spent the following 2 days assembling the full record. Opal's letters, Wren's filings, the copied documents, the sequence of events mapped out in Wren's second notebook in the clear logical progression that made the shape of Jerome's arrangement impossible to misread. Wren organized it the way she organized everything, not for maximum drama, but for maximum clarity, because clarity was the thing that could not be argued with. On the morning of the assessment panel's scheduled deliberation, she brought the full document to Colt at the kitchen table. He read it in silence from first page to last while the coffee went cold beside him. Wren sat across from him and did not watch him read, looked instead out the kitchen window at the gray morning, the frost still on the grass, the gray gelding moving in the paddock with his characteristic unhurried authority. When Colt finished, he set the document down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "We need to bring this to the panel before they issue their determination." "Yes," Wren said. He looked up at her. "Can you present it?" "Yes," she said. "That's what I built it for." They went to the township hall together, arriving before the assessors had reconvened from their morning recess. The senior assessor received them in the small anteroom off the main hall with the wary courtesy of a man who has been in this work long enough to know that late submissions to active proceedings are never straightforward. He looked at the document. He looked at Wren. He looked at Colt. He said he would need a few minutes and went to speak with his colleagues. Jerome was already in the main hall when they entered. He was sitting at his table with the solicitor Graves, and when Wren and Colt came through the door, he looked at them with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. He had expected Colt. He had not expected the document under Wren's arm thick and organized, the product of weeks of patient, careful work. He looked at Wren directly. She looked back at him without expression. The assessors took their seats. The senior assessor explained that new evidence had been submitted and would be entered into the record. Graves objected, as Graves was paid to object. The assessors conferred briefly and overruled the objection, as was their right. Wren stood and presented the document. She did not perform it. She did not dramatize it or editorialize it or make any attempt to shape how the room felt about what she was presenting. She simply walked through the record piece by piece in the quiet, logical sequence she had built and let the evidence make its own argument. The room was very quiet. Jerome's face went through several things while she spoke. The careful pleasantness dissolved, first replaced by something more calculating, and then the calculation gave way to something flatter and colder. The expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is watching the ground give way beneath the waiting. When she finished, she sat down. The assessors conferred for a long time. Jerome's solicitor made arguments. The assessors asked questions primarily of Wren about the provenance of specific documents and the chain of custody and the methodology of her research. She answered them in the same register she had answered everything accurately, specifically, without embellishment. At some point in the late afternoon, the senior assessor read the panel's preliminary determination. The challenge to the will provision was suspended pending a full review of the newly submitted evidence. The original property arrangement was to remain in effect during the review period, and a separate inquiry was recommended into the circumstances of the provision's insertion into the original document. Jerome stood. He and Graves exchanged a look that contained in its compression the entire arithmetic of a plan that has just become significantly more expensive and complicated than anticipated. Then Jerome straightened his coat and picked up his hat and walked out of the township hall without looking at Colt or Wren. He did not look like a man who was defeated. He looked like a man who was recalculating. But recalculating took time, and time was what they had just won. The room began to empty. People moved around Wren and Colt with the slightly heightened energy of a community that has just witnessed something significant and is deciding how to process it. Some of them spoke to Colt brief direct words, the valley equivalent of acknowledgement. A few of them looked at Wren with expressions that had changed since the last time she had been looked at in this hall, as though the person they were seeing now had shifted slightly in relation to the category they had initially placed her in. Opal found them outside on the steps, her coat buttoned against the cold, her eyes bright with the satisfied energy of a woman whose long patience has just been vindicated. She gripped Wren's arm briefly and said nothing which was more eloquent than anything she could have said, and then she went to speak to the Prentice family who had arrived late and were standing in the street with the bewildered expressions of people who have just been told their land is safer than it was this morning and do not yet entirely believe it. Wren and Colt stood on the steps of the township hall in the pale afternoon. The street was busy with the aftercurrent of the preceding people talking news, spreading at the particular velocity of important information in a small place. The cold was serious, but still the air clean and carrying the particular quality of autumn light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it usually does. She was very tired. Not the bad kind, the kind that comes after a long, difficult thing has been completed, when the body finally releases the tension it has been holding, and the tiredness comes through like a season changing. "The Lund brothers are going to want to buy you dinner," Colt said. Wren looked at him. "They've been worried about the lower pasture for 2 seasons, he said. "They just don't know that yet. When they find out," a pause, "they'll want to buy everyone dinner. That's how they respond to things." "I'll decline," Wren said. "They won't take no easily. I'll manage." Something moved in his expression, the shadow of that not-quite smile that appeared so rarely and meant something specific every time. "You generally do," he said. They drove back to Ironwood in the late afternoon, the valley going gold and long-shadowed around them. The light was the best kind of autumn light, the kind that makes the grass look like it has been lit from beneath the ridgelines, sharp against a sky going pale at the edges. Wren sat on the wagon bench beside Colt and let the tiredness move through her, and looked at the land and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The community dinner happened 3 weeks later. It had been Opal's idea, which meant it had been carefully managed and completely inevitable. She had simply begun telling people that there would be a dinner at the Hawthorne Ranch on the first Saturday of the month, which happened to coincide with a clear weather window and the end of the heaviest work of the autumn season, and that they were welcome to come and bring food. And people had come because Opal asked them to, and because the valley had needed something like this for longer than any particular occasion could account for. They arrived in the mid-afternoon, wagons and horses coming down the main road from both directions. The sound of them reaching the ranch before they were visible, the low percussion of hooves and wheels, voices carrying across the open ground, the particular productive noise of a community that has decided collectively to inhabit a space together. The Prentice family brought 3 pies and a ham. The McGrew widow brought bread that she had apparently been baking since dawn, loaf after loaf, stacked in her wagon bed with the thoroughness of a woman who expresses care through volume. The Lund brothers, who were exactly what Colt had described, arrived with a barrel of something they had made themselves and strong opinions about where it should be positioned relative to the fire. Wren stood on the porch in the early part of the afternoon and watched them come, and felt something move through her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. It was not happiness exactly, or not only that. It was something more structural than happiness, the feeling of being in a place that was arranging itself into something that would last, something that had enough weight and warmth in it to push back against the cold. She worked alongside the other women through the afternoon with the ease of someone who has finally found the rhythm of a new place, knowing where things were kept, knowing how the kitchen worked, knowing the small navigational details of a space that had become in the past months genuinely familiar. The women worked with her with the same easiness, the subtle shift in tone that happens when a community has decided not officially or all at once, but steadily and collectively, that a person belongs. Mrs. Hartwell, who had asked the question at the market, appeared at the kitchen table with a contribution of preserved plums and an expression that was not apologetic exactly, but contained in its careful pleasantness an acknowledgement of something. She made no reference to the question. She talked about her daughter's winter preparations and the condition of the South Road and the quality of the season's grain harvest. Wren talked back about the same things in the same tone, and by the time Mrs. Hartwell left the kitchen, she was carrying a small jar of the spiced applesauce Wren had made from the remaining fall fruit, and something had been exchanged that did not require naming. The dinner itself spread out across the yard in the long golden light of early evening tables brought outside, and the fire built high, and the sound of 30 people eating and talking and occasionally laughing, filling the space where 3 months ago there had been only the wind and the particular heavy silence of a place that had forgotten what it felt like to be inhabited by more than necessity. Colt moved through it with the deliberate ease of a man who is more comfortable in the middle of things than he generally allows himself to be. Wren watched him from across the yard at intervals, talking to the Lund brothers with the abbreviated directness of men who do not need many words between them, sitting for a moment with the McGrew widow, who had apparently known him since before he was the man he currently was accepting a cup of something from Opal with the expression of a man who knows he is being managed and has decided to permit it. At one point, he looked across the yard and found her looking, and they held that for a moment, just a look. And then he went back to his conversation, and she went back to hers. And the distance between them, across the crowded yard, felt for the first time like something she was choosing, rather than something that had been imposed. The evening went long. Families began to gather their things gradually, the way gatherings end in places where people have come from a distance and have to be practical about the journey home. There were handshakes and briefly gripped arms, and the particular warmth of goodbyes that are not sad, because the people saying them understand they will see each other again before long. The Lund brothers were last to leave, which surprised no one. They shook Colt's hand for a considerable time and said things to Wren that were direct and genuine and slightly overwhelming in their thoroughness. And then they went, and then the yard was quiet. Opal was the very last. She helped clear the remaining things from the tables with the methodical efficiency of a woman who has cleaned up after gatherings for 40 years and knows exactly how to move through it. When the tables were clear and the fire was banked and the yard was as close to its ordinary self as it was going to be tonight, she put on her coat and picked up her basket and came to Wren on the porch. She held Wren's hands briefly in both of hers, a gesture that was not dramatic, but was very warm, the particular warmth of an older woman who has decided that a younger one is worth claiming. "Good night, Wren," she said. "Good night, Opal," Wren said. Opal went down the porch steps and across the yard to where her horse waited with the patient resignation of Opal's horses, which were accustomed to late nights, and rode off into the darkness toward the east ridge. The yard was quiet. The fire had burned to embers, throwing a low amber light across the cleared tables, and the churned mud of 30 people's worth of comings and goings. The sky above was extraordinary, the kind of sky that only presents itself when the air is cold and perfectly clear, thick with stars, the band of them across the center so dense it looked solid. Wren sat on the top porch step and looked at it. She heard Colt come out behind her, the familiar sound of his boots on the boards, the particular weight of his step. He sat beside her on the step close enough that the length of his arm rested against hers. He did not say anything. They both looked at the sky. After a while, he reached into his coat pocket. He brought out the contract, not her copy, which she had left on the kitchen table with her note, but the original. The one that had been signed and witnessed and filed and kept in the drawer of his desk since the day it was made. She recognized the paper, the quality of it, the different fold pattern from her own copy. He held it for a moment between his hands. Then he tore it. Clean once, and then again. He set the pieces on the step beside him without ceremony. Wren looked at the pieces of paper, then at him. "I want to ask you something," Colt said. He turned and looked at her directly with the full gray-green attention that she had come to understand meant he was doing the hardest thing available to him in any given moment, opening the direct channel, the one he kept closed, because it required a kind of exposure that did not come naturally to a man who had learned to love in the peripheral language of action. "Not because of the will," he said. "Not because of the spring deadline, or the provision, or any of the things that were true when I placed that advertisement." He paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man choosing words with the care he usually applied to physical problems, making sure the structure would hold. "Because you came here with one bag and a contract you read every clause of, and you have not once pretended to be something you are not. Because you went out to a horse in the dark on your first night, and you stood straight in every room where someone tried to make you less." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "Because I have been doing this wrong for a long time, and I would like if you are willing to try doing it differently." Wren looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The stars were very bright. The valley below them was completely still, the grass silver in the cold light, the creek a dark ribbon running through it. She thought about the woman who had boarded a stagecoach months ago with one bag and a contract that had an exit built into it. She thought about the word that had been used as a verdict and the boarding house room and the 8 months of trying to determine whether she was angry or ashamed or neither. She thought about being invisible, not by choice, but by attrition, the slow erosion of being told in 100 different ways that her presence was insufficient. She thought about coming here to disappear. She thought about how thoroughly she had failed at that particular intention. She reached into her coat pocket. She had put it there that morning for no reason she had consciously articulated, simply an impulse, the candy wrapper, the butterscotch one, folded into a small square. She had not eaten the candy. She had not thrown the wrapper away. It had traveled with her from the day on the rain-drenched porch, through Opal's spare room, through the hearing and the final week of documents and the determination, and this evening sitting in her pocket with the quiet persistence of a small thing that has decided to be kept. She held it out. He looked at it, and she saw the precise moment he understood what it was, a brief shift in his expression, something that moved through it, like light moving through water. He took it from her palm, held it in his. "Yes," Wren said, quietly, simply. The same economy she had always used for the things that mattered most. He did not speak. He closed his hand around the wrapper and looked at her, and the expression on his face was not a complicated one. It was the expression of a man who has arrived after a long journey across difficult ground at a place he had stopped believing existed, and who is standing still for a moment before moving forward because he wants to be certain it is real. He turned back to face the valley. She turned too. They sat side by side on the porch step in the cold night air with their shoulders touching, and the torn contract beside them, and the fire dying down to its last warmth, and the stars enormous overhead. After a long time, Colt said, "The gray gelding's been following you around the paddock." "I know," Wren said. "He doesn't do that with people as a general rule." "I noticed." A pause. "He's particular." "Most worth-knowing things are," Wren said. "The fire went to embers. The embers went to ash." They stayed on the step until the cold finally became too serious to ignore, and then they went inside, and the door of the Hawthorne house closed behind them both, and the valley held its deep and patient silence. Spring arrived the way things arrived in high country, not gradually, but in a single day of decision, the temperature shifting overnight, and the air the following morning carrying the particular quality of a world that has just remembered what warmth is. The frost came off the grass by mid-morning. The creek, which had been running low and slow under its winter restraint, lifted and quickened. Wren was in the paddock when the change happened, standing with the gray gelding whose name she had learned from Colt one evening when she asked was Atlas named by Colt's father for reasons that had never been explained and did not need to be. Atlas stood beside her at the fence rail with the comfortable solidity of an animal that has sorted out the question of where it belongs his weight, shifting occasionally against her shoulder with the particular easy pressure of a large creature that trusts a small one. She heard the barn doors. She heard his step across the yard, the familiar weight and rhythm of it. She did not turn around. She looked out at the valley, the new green beginning at the edges of the brown winter grass, the creek catching the morning light, the ridge lines against a sky that had gone from pale winter white to something deeper and more genuine, a blue that meant it. Colt stopped beside her at the fence. Atlas acknowledged him with the mild attention of an animal that has accepted two people as a unit and has stopped treating their arrivals as separate events. Wren looked out at the valley. She was not thinking about the contract, which was in pieces somewhere and had not been thought about in weeks. She was not thinking about Jerome, whose legal situation was now in the hands of the reviewing authority and would be for some time, and whose arrangement with the land company had collapsed when the private correspondence became part of the official record. She was not thinking about the assessors or the township hall or Mrs. Vera Holloway or the word that had been used as a verdict. She was thinking about the fact that the eastern pasture needed the south fence checked before the cattle were moved out of the winter paddock, and that the creek level would need monitoring for the next few weeks until the melt stabilized, and that the Lund brothers had offered to send a man to help with the barn repairs, and she needed to tell Colt about that. She was thinking about the ordinary shape of a day that was hers. Colt rested his arms on the fence rail beside her. He did not say anything. He looked at the valley the way he always looked at it, with the attention of a man who has known a piece of land long enough to read it the way other people read faces. After a while he said, "South fence needs checking." "I know," Wren said. "I was just thinking that." He turned and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him, and neither of them said anything further, and Atlas moved between them slightly and put his large head over the fence rail and regarded the valley with the serene authority of a horse that has decided this arrangement is satisfactory. The morning light moved across the grass in long, slow waves. The creek ran. Somewhere on the ridge, a bird was doing something emphatic and optimistic in the new warmth. Wren Calloway, who had come to Ironwood with one bag and a contract with an exit written into it, who had arrived intending to be invisible, who had spent a long time believing the most honest thing she could do was expect nothing, stood in the spring morning with her shoulder against the shoulder of the man beside her, and felt, without drama and without qualification, entirely at home. It was not a grand feeling. It did not arrive with ceremony or with the swelling sense of resolution she had sometimes read about in the novels she had borrowed from the lending library back east. It arrived the way most true things arrived in her experience, quietly sideways while she was looking at something else. One moment she was thinking about the south fence and the creek levels and the Lund brothers' offer of labor, and the next moment she simply knew with the particular clarity of something that has been true for a while and is only now being acknowledged, that she was not going to leave. Not at 12 months. Not at any month. This land, with its wide, indifferent sky, and its high, cold winters, and its extraordinary silences, and its community of people who expressed care through practicality and showed up when it mattered, this was her place now. And the man beside her, who was still learning to say things out loud, but had never once failed to show up, who had installed a lock on a door for a stranger and moved her water buckets and noticed which candy she always looked at, and had stood beside her in a street and said nothing and meant everything. This was her person. She did not say any of this. She did not look behind her. There was nothing behind her worth the looking. The valley opened out ahead of them, wide and gold green and entirely indifferent to the arrangements of the small human lives being lived within it. And the morning came on, as mornings do, without permission, without promise. And with today, a quality of warmth that felt very much like both.